Bloober Team is a contentious company. They're best known for their psychological horror games, which have found their way into the mainstream, at least as mainstream as psychological horror games get, with big titles such as Layers of Fear 2, and the recently released Layers of Fears, which has since been renamed to Layers of Fear. And there's a number of reasons why this company is not wholly, but loudly disliked. Historically, their depiction of mental illness and general psychological torment has been less than ideal, which has Silent Hill fans worried due to their upcoming remake of Silent Hill 2, a famously effective psychological horror. Their games have also been historically very mechanically simple, which is not a bad thing in itself, but it has Silent Hill fans worried due to their upcoming remake of Silent Hill 2, a famous non-walking simulator. And the point of controversy I feel most passionate about is their treatment of PT/Silent Hills, potentially the most influential piece of horror media released, or not released, in the last decade. For some developers saw Konami's ill-fated resurrection of the Silent Hill franchise as inspiration for their own projects, like Capcom taking the slow, claustrophobic, psychological, vulnerable first-person aspects of PT and using them to reinvent Resident Evil, changing it from the critically mixed, absurd action horror of Resident Evil 6 into the universally acclaimed horror masterclass that is Resident Evil 7. Other developers, most famously Bloober Team, saw PT and thought, yeah, let's do that like 5 to 10 more times. Which has Silent Hill fans worried due to their upcoming remake of Silent Hill 2 for like 5 to 10 different reasons. But a few years ago, Bloober Team released this, Blair Witch, a game set in the Blair Witch universe following the Blair Witch movie from 2016, which was itself a sequel to the Blair Witch Project from 1999, and not Book of Shadows Blair Witch 2 from the year 2000. This also shouldn't be confused with the 3 other Blair Witch games which came out in the early 2000s as well. Bloober Team is certainly drawn to a certain flavor of naming schemes. For those unfamiliar with the Blair Witch Project, people walk around some woods with cameras, and very little happens. And it's really very good. And that setup sounds right up Bloober Team's alley. The series kind of drifted away from that with the 2016 reboot, where people walk around some woods with cameras and way too much happens, which I fear is the direction Bloober Team may actually take this game. And as for Book of Shadows Blair Witch 2, nobody has ever seen this movie, so I can't possibly comment. So with all that said, let's get into it. We start off driving towards Burkittsville, formerly known as Blair, the setting of the films. A woman on the radio tells us that there is a missing boy, and we are a looking man. Oh, and we have a dog. Yes, I'm not gonna talk too much about the dog. I'm sure everyone and their mother has already done that, so let's just move past it. Anyway, the game introduces the idea of narrative choices to us, and the first choice we're given is whether or not to answer the phone while driving. It doesn't really seem to mind that you are actively endangering yourself and others with blasé vehicular negligence, so I'm going to assume that this is the renegade path. And from this point on, I decided to always pick the options that I deemed most in contrast to the highway code. Oh, you know that thing I said about not talking about the dog too much? Never mind, you can customize him. I'm absolutely going to talk about this. It's spectacular. I'm literally shaking. Buy him brown contacts, please. Their first mistake upon letting us loose into the world was giving me an entire phone to look through. You best believe I went through all of this man's messages and contacts and called every single person I could. Only the vet and the pizza place even responded, and all other lines were busy. Even Keith. It's 7:30 a.m. or p.m. I have no idea. I guess things were different in 1996. Everybody on they goddamn phones all the time. According to something I found in my character's wallet, my lucky numbers are 2 and 125. Watch that have no significance whatsoever in the entire game. We arrive at a load of police cars and steal a police radio and main character our way into the search for the missing boy, despite basically everybody else saying, can you not do that? Multiple times. This comes with some of the most abhorrently heavy-handed dialogue I have heard in a long time, and it's in the second conversation in the whole game. You don't have an obligation to be here. I know it's his brother and all. Even with your health issues. You dumb fuck. I won't screw up this time and cause a bad thing to happen again that will almost certainly be brought up later. Bloober Team doesn't think that foreshadowing is quite enough, and instead they're opting for the rare tactic of 8-shadowing here. At least we know that our character has a dark backstory or some other fun psychological horror game trope. And it seems like I was wrong about the main choices in this game, as they don't seem to revolve around driving theory tests, and are instead you choosing whether or not to be a dickhead to your dog and or partner, which I guess is also par for the course for psychological horror games. While searching for the boy, the police seem to wrap police tape around random trees throughout this forest, which, I don't know, may be actual protocol, or it may just be very odd map design from the developers. It reminds me of a deep sadness I have, that I've never actually found a corpse in the wilderness like the media has always promised me. It's not really a comment about the game, and more of a look into my growing jadedness regarding never finding a body in the woods. So it seems that our main character, Ellis the Boy Finder Man, has PTSD caused by his time at war, on top of whatever dark backstory he has regarding the missing child. If you go without your dog or other company for long enough, he has panic attacks or some kind of other psychological episode. I don't know enough about PTSD and trauma psychology at large, but I know that this is a bit, bloober of them. It's actually a few steps worse than Amnesia Rebirth's baby checking button mechanic, because this carries the very sensitive topic of mental health, whereas Amnesia's had the much more casual and friendly topic of pregnancy and eye worms. Also, for a man with war-based PTSD, you'd think he'd pick a more suitable name for his dog than Bullet, but it turns out the dog was a gift from the sheriff, so you can't really blame him too much. We then find a digital camera in the woods and realize we're either in a found footage horror movie from the 2000s or an indie horror game from the 2010s, and that immediately makes us pass out from fear. And we pass out for either 4 or 16 hours depending on if it was 7 AM or 7 PM at the start. If it was 7 PM, then why the hell were the police starting their search for the missing boy in the mid-evening, in the haunted woods, full of bear traps? It turns out this is definitely an indie horror game camera, because it allows us to manipulate time. Cool. That's just brilliant. I mean, it's a fun little mechanic that is very much in line with current psychological horror games, but when you're making a game based on an established IP, it's maybe best to not dramatically alter the rules like that. But as a recent film school graduate, I can confirm that cinematographers and ACs can actually do this in real life, so whatever. Now that it's nighttime, I have 2 things to say. First of all, the atmosphere is actually really great. It's a shame that the levels are enormous and have just enough little collectibles and trinkets hidden to keep a little goblin boy like me way too busy. Honestly, I could lose hours in this game just going from corner to corner of each section of forest trying to find something new, all while not really enjoying it in the slightest. Just to say that I had in fact found everything. As much as I enjoy finding little hidden things, it dramatically breaks apart the pacing and makes the whole game feel a bit odd. A lot of games have done this before, most similarly things like The Vanishing of Ethan Carter, which this game shares a lot in common with. Second of all, the flashlight is actually good, and this is huge for me. It behaves like a normal flashlight, and Ellis is smart enough to lock it on to points of relative interest, which makes it feel a little bit like I'm playing Time Splitters or System Shock with their unlocked crosshairs. We can also use this camcorder that we found to go into night vision mode when our flashlight stops working, which feels both good and bad. Good because it's paying homage to the found footage horror roots of the series, but also bad because it feels a little shoehorned in. Other games like Outlast, despite my relative dislike of Outlast, which I'll talk about some other time, have made the found footage aesthetic work way more naturally. You've got to commit to it or it does feel odd. If you're wondering how to make a camcorder or something similar feel natural in a setting, don't worry. Found footage films have been making flimsy excuses as to why people are recording stuff for years. You don't really need much justification as to why a camera is recording at all, because people rarely question it. If you ever see a video of some strange, inexplicable thing happening like a ghost or cryptid or gnome sighting, ask yourself this: why was somebody recording in the first place? That's a very easy way to debunk pretty much all of them, and they kind of rely on the fact that nobody's ever going to ask. Sorry, Chills, and Nuke's Top 5s, and Darman. There is one good part of the insane map design, that being that it kind of impossibly loops in on itself, much like is implied on the films. However, this is also your classic looping hallway gameplay that's in basically every horror game post-2014, so it's not exactly impressing me anymore. It also makes my exploration very inconvenient because I can lose my bearings pretty fast, and that's not good when I'm trying to find cool collectibles like Polaroids of corpses or whatever the fuck this is. We soon encounter our first enemy after an annoying section where you're teleported around to cause Ellis some gamified PTSD stress, and well, it's every enemy in every horror game after 2014. unnaturally moving, twitchy thing that's facing away from you for some reason, and apparently the protocol for this is to not run directly into it. And I don't know if I've missed something, but it seems like we're given absolutely no indication on how to avoid these things once they're aggroed. I got into this horrible chase sequence, I think, where two of them were just kind of zipping around while I was trapped in a little bunker trying to brute force a puzzle. I was there for a really long time, and eventually I just tried running and, well, that didn't go so well. In fact, it went so unwell that I ended up being killed and teleported out of bounds to some strange barren spot where I was able to fall off the map. What is happening? Oh good, my last save was nearly a quarter of an hour ago. Let's try again. It turns out all you have to do is shine your flashlight at them, sometimes, and they'll get annoyed enough at you and just kind of leave you alone not too long after. I have many thoughts about these enemies and many things to say, both good and bad, that I will leave until later, but for now, let me just say, dog good, dog help kill baddies, dog good. They clearly got the inspiration for these enemies from a single 3-second long shot in the 2016 movie where they shine a flashlight at a guy and he certainly does not like it. And that 3-second long shot directed the entirety of the combat, if you want to call it that, for this entire game. They don't make cars like they used to. Back in the day, your headlights would activate the sun. So yes, we turn on a car and now it's daytime and nobody seems to be that bothered by it. Ellis would clearly rather talk to his estranged partner and discuss their relationship issues. It's very strange that this is part of the story when we've already got so many threads on the go. We've got the missing kid, the PTSD, the warping forest. Why add the relationship melodrama too? It's a major problem with a lot of psychological horror and this kind of embodies it perfectly. Anyway, here's a desecrated corpse. Does LiveLeak have AdSense? It's a shame so much of the game takes place during the night, because in daylight, parts of this game look absolutely stunning, especially the part right before you get chased by an attack helicopter. Yes, that actually happens. In a Blair Witch game. I don't think this is exactly what PTSD is like. This does the classic psychological horror thing of a descent into madness, and Bloober Team just love doing this with visual effects. FOV changes? Yeah, that sounds like psychosis to me. Static? The color of stress. And nothing says, you need therapy, like chromatic aberration. Call me jaded, but I'm very sick of all of these being used pretty much everywhere. Bloober Team gets a bad rap for their games and style, but honestly they're just the scapegoat for a huge number of horror devs, especially indie horror devs. If you've made a psychological horror game in the last 10 years where you're playing as the bad guy after all, or where somebody is living through a personification of their trauma or guilt, or someone mentally ill has become some kind of scary murderer or ghost, or there's a looping hallway that slowly deteriorates to show how fucked things really are under the surface, Bloober Team is your Jesus. They are being crucified for your sins. The difference here is that Bloober Team also committed these sins, so they're not quite like Jesus. If I go to hell for this comparison, I will be very upset. Anyway, we go through a big tunnel and somebody horrifically messes up the phonetic alphabet while some miscellaneous scary person, presumably the Witch of the Blair, tells us that we're now besties. This is then interrupted by a flashback in which we are told that we shot someone, and then we see a bunch of American soldiers fall out of a helicopter like a fucked up clown car. Somehow these events are connected. I know I've already touched on it, but why are they making this Blair Witch game about, well, anything other than the Blair Witch? It seems like Bloober Team wanted to make a separate game about somebody with PTSD, then remembered they had a license to use and quickly threw together some forest levels. It's weird that this has happened to the Blair Witch series twice, but more on that another day. At some points, they altogether drop the pretense of this being a Blair Witch game at all. Eventually, you're just bloobering around some strange obstacle course where there's giant balls of leaves that are literally stand-ins for artillery shells and Middle Eastern military forces, and no, I am actually not making that up. They throw in a couple of Blair Witchy enemies to remind you what you're playing, but this is completely batshit insane. Now we're in an active war zone. Maybe I don't want to let go of Bullet. You doing okay, buddy? I find a note that tells me about some potentially invisible creatures that can only be caught on camera, which is a neat idea, if not one that's been done a few times, and it's very promising as the only two enemy types I've encountered so far have been boys that can literally be killed with a flashlight and giant rolling balls of leaves, which Ellis is fucking terrified of. Both of these enemies can be theoretically beaten by simply waiting. For the boys, just wait until daytime. For the leaves, Really just wait until any season other than autumn. The sawmill bit after the inevitable train bridge collapse scene that all of the Blair Witch movies are famous for is actually incredibly unsettling. It does the classic found footage horror thing, which the game has been sorely lacking up until this point, of having somebody blending into the surroundings and having their presence be made known horribly late. Unfortunately, this is kind of ruined by Ellis straight up saying, "Someone's here," instead of leaving it up to the player to figure it out, so it's not that great. And a few times throughout the game, I thought it would have been perfect to have ominous figures standing amidst some foggy trees or some dilapidated ruins, but to my knowledge, that's been sorely lacking. So this, regardless of it being poorly handled, was a lovely step in the right direction. But yes, we're introduced to the idea of there being a horrible murderer bloke in the woods alongside the very forgettable enemies, which frankly makes things a lot scarier. And he's into shrooms, which is cool, I guess. He's also nice to my dog, way nicer than I am. We take a swing at him and swiftly regret it, and we're thrown into another flashback where it's revealed what event specifically triggered Ellis's PTSD. He was in charge of a group of soldiers and led them into an ambush where a load of them died and a load more were injured. He also maimed a young man and killed an innocent woman, but he doesn't seem to care so much about those parts. And yes, this is still a game about the Blair Witch series, and Carver, the nice dog murderer man who skins people in the woods, fucked with our camera's ISO settings and turned on focus assist or whatever the hell this is, and now we can see mystery goo and scary shapes. How fun! They tried to do something really cool in this next part where it's all foggy and there's invisible enemies and Bullet is actually more of a hindrance than a help, but it really does not land. If you've played Modern Warfare, not to be confused with Modern Warfare, or Modern Warfare 2, not to be confused with Modern Warfare 2, then you'll know the stealth missions where you're guided mostly by voice commands and level design rather than traditional corridor shooter norms, and they do something fairly similar here. While going through the fog, Carver gives you directions and tries to make little comments on your progress. The problem is, most of the time he's completely wrong, and rather than looking like an omniscient villain, he just comes across as hilariously misinformed. There's also some cheap scares in this bit, like this awful jump scare out of nowhere that really soured what could have been a cool moment. Carver in general is an odd character. He kind of claws it back to being closer to a Blair Witch vibe than a miscellaneous Bloober Team thing, but he still has the wrong feel overall. He brings a kind of folk horror cult feel to things, whereas the beauty of the original Blair Witch Project is that it was an early example of what would come to be known as the ARG style of horror, which, in one way or another, is still around today. Boring ass forest. In this next section, they commit 2 cardinal sins. Nay, 3 cardinal sins. Fuck it, 4 of them. First of all, they give us a gun and tell us to kill our dog. We don't do it. Yahoo! But then Ellis just throws the gun away. I mean, I understand why he wouldn't want it, but it's still pretty frustrating, especially when the main villain at this point is a flesh man. Secondly, they tried to get us to give up on Bullet when he gets hurt. Fuck you, game. I hate that. I understand the whole thing of getting players to do stuff they morally oppose, but there's a line to be drawn at animals. Let me kill the missing kid. I don't give a shit. Just stay off of my creatures. Thirdly, there's a looping hallway with evolving text on the walls. Good lord. Fourthly, a looping hallway with moving paths and spatial impossibilities and whispering voices. Great. We are getting seriously Bloober Teamed here, and we don't actually get a say in Bullet's fate, because the game eventually just makes you give up on him after a while, despite there being a button to do so already. I don't even understand what's the point in giving us the choice to do it, if we're just going to do it anyway. Regardless, shit gets weird again, but then something incredibly promising happens. If you've seen the original Blair Witch Project, you will have seen what I consider to be one of the most single, frightening, and perplexing sequences in all of cinema history, that being the final scene in the derelict house. And wonderfully, even if it is fairly shameless fan service, this game attempts to recreate that dread and does so very, very well. The creeping through the house is excellent and is truly the highlight of the game in terms of atmosphere and faithfulness to the source material. I was absolutely hooked. For a few minutes. Unfortunately, this is where an event transpires that I can only refer to as a Bloober Team sadist masturbate-a-thon, because no good deed can go unbloobed. The next 30 to 50 minutes of the game, which happens to be the final 30 to 50 minutes of the game, is the most shameless exercise in Bloober Team tropes and PT inspiration that you will ever see. constant looping hallways, constant allegedly creepy voice lines and hallucinations, forced stealth segments, endless visual effects and distortions, and overall just the most tiring kind of psychological horror that money can buy. And it's so aggressively shit. It even has the classic psychological horror reveals that you are actually the bad guy and oh no, you've done such terrible things. And then, just to follow that entire shit show up, I end up getting the bad ending because I decided to break a few effigies and shine a flashlight at some folks. Yes, that's actually how you get the bad ending. Here's the list of criteria for the good ending. Do not leave Bullet behind in the final chapter, which I assume means don't press the button to give up on him and just give up on him when the timer expires. Do not pick up any of the carved figurines you find except for the 3 in the final chapters. You need those to progress. During the last chapter, do not follow the witch's orders. This means not killing the sheriff, etc., which I wasn't aware was a choice. Do not kill the enemies hiding in the trees. Instead of using your flashlight, use the camera with night vision to sneak past. And do not destroy any of the totems you find throughout the game. That's right, if you collect the collectibles, you're a morally incorrect being. Not a single mention of desecrating the highway code, or speaking to your estranged wife, or speaking to your dog in a bad way. None of that stuff matters. Thankfully, Bullet ended up being okay. Maybe he can go on to an owner that won't take him into the Bloober Team Witch Gulch. I said in my last video on Metal Gear Survive that it's rare to see a game so clearly showcase its own lost potential, but that's exactly what they do in this last segment here. They got so close to having a genuinely wonderful and accurate Blair Witch vibe, but they just couldn't help themselves. They clearly went 20 minutes without replaying PT or messing around in After Effects during development, which led to one shining moment of brilliance, but don't worry, they quickly saw to that. What has me so heated about this particular aspect... the game's also done now. During that rant, the game just kind of ended. Whatever. But yes, what has me so heated is that they managed to prove that they could have made a genuinely great found footage style horror game. They could have done it. They tried to at points. They succeeded at points, but they just couldn't help themselves. Now you may be wondering what happened to the game's story, like, what happened to the missing child, the whole focus of the entire journey so far. Well, you're not told at the end, unless you're a lucky boy like me who managed to find, of all things, a fucking 9-volt battery inside the derelict house, which has no use in your first playthrough, but by some incredible move of a witch-based battery displacement, carries into the second playthrough and allows you to power up a radio, and this is what happens then.
Missing 9-year-old Peter Shannon has been found alive after 3 days of search. Police report that the boy was found wandering alone near Black Rock Road. The boy is in a state of shock and was unable to answer any questions, but...
Yeah, it turns out the kid's fine. As I imagined, the game is way more interested in the aggressively middling 2016 movie rather than the wonderful 90s film. I know that the found footage genre is very divisive, and the subgenre of found footage where really very little happens is even more divisive, but the first film would have been such a better basis for Bloober Team to work from. The movie itself is a scary walking simulator, that's its whole deal, but no, Bloober Team bloobed all over it, and now it carries the strangely sticky viscera of contemporary psychological horror games. Anyway, that's all I really have to say about this game. It's very pretty, it's aggressively middling, and the world should fear the upcoming Silent Hill 2 remake. I do have something vaguely interesting to mention though, and no, it's not anything to do with the game. I'm relaunching my Patreon account. For those who remember, I had one a couple of years ago, but stopped it due to low activity on my end. But now I'm out of university and I'm ready to commit a lot more time to this. And by that I mean I have to now start paying tax. Holy shit. Anyway, if you'd like to donate, please go to patreon.com/Painticus and take a look. It's also linked in the description. Currently the tiers are $3, $5, and $10, each offering very similar things to those kind enough to donate. And don't worry, my videos are still going to be available as normal, even if you don't join there. But yes, that's everything. Thank you for watching. I hope you're all having a wonderful time, and I'll see you again soon.